It is 10:48. I've been doing this for about like 2 hours trying to debug it, but I really have no idea what it could possibly be. So I recently self-diagnosed myself with GAS, Gear Acquisition Syndrome. And if you or a loved one suffers from this, let me know in the comments. I just want to tell you, you're not alone. And with that, let's get into the Fractal Mood build. You ever start building a PC thinking, I got this, only to realize you definitely don't got this? Yeah, that was me with this build. Normally, I don't even look at the instructions until I absolutely have to, which is a terrible habit, I know. So as usual, I just started building, assuming I figured things out along the way. Let me know in the comments if this is you too. First, I needed to open the case. I figured, how hard could that be? But after struggling for longer than I care to admit, I finally caved and checked the manual. It turns out all I had to do was remove a panel and then screw 2 screws. Then, instead of reading through everything, I skipped straight to the build process, and that's when I misread something important. I saw a section mentioning an air cooler, and for some reason thought the case required one. If I had actually read the instructions properly, I would have realized that wasn't the case, but more on that a little later. Instead, I panicked, thinking my AIO wouldn't fit, because in my last build, I ran into 90-degree thermal spikes before I switched to my liquid cooling solution. So now, thinking I had to go air-cooled again, yeah, I was not happy about that. But at this point, I had no choice but to move forward. So I started prepping the motherboard. For this build, I'm using the AMD 7800X3D, the Gigabyte Aorus B650i, 2TB of Samsung 980 Pro, and 32GB of DDR5 RAM. When I started installing the CPU cooler, I noticed one of the screws failed to thread all the way, which I assumed was the reason for the high temps in my last build. So I cranked it down as much as I could without damaging the CPU until there was little to no gap between the CPU and the cooler. Then I installed the motherboard into the case. I'm always amazed how all of this has so much power. Like, it's so tiny. Next, I installed the power supply, which was pretty straightforward. Then I connected the IO ports to the motherboard. After that, I reinstalled the plate that covered the motherboard and power supply. The instructions didn't mention plugging in the PSU cables first, so I had to unscrew it again once I realized that. I plugged in every cable from the PSU except for the GPU and screwed the plate back in. And now, if you want to install an AIO, you will have to remove this hard drive cage. I didn't realize this until after the build, and this is where it pays to look at the instructions or do a little bit of research beforehand. Anyways, it's nice that they include the hard drive and SSD base for extra storage without spending hundreds on more NVMe. I didn't have any hard drives or SSDs, so I had to skip this step. Finally, it was time for the fun part, installing the GPU. For this build, I am using the infamous RTX 5070 Ti. If you want to see how I got it, check out my last video linked up here. It was perfect because I didn't realize this case only allows for 2 slot cards, so my 4090 Founders Edition wouldn't fit anyways. Installing the GPU was super easy compared to my last 2 builds. Once everything was installed, I slid back the main cover, screwed it in, and placed the exterior shell back in place. The entire build process took me like 30 minutes, and most of that was because of that CPU cooler hiccup. Now it was time for the moment of truth. The computer booted up, displaying in lower resolution as expected since I didn't have the drivers installed. I figured I could just install them, select the advanced options and choose to clean install, and remove any existing drivers from my 4090. But mid-installation, the screen went black and it never turned back on. I love how I run into issues all the time. Funny enough, A friend of mine who was new to PC building had a similar setup and ran into the exact same issue. At first, I didn't think much of it, just bad luck, right? He later told me that after hours of troubleshooting, he got it working by using DDU and a BIOS update. Apparently, the dedicated graphics from the CPU and the GPU were conflicting. So I installed DDU, but had issues getting into safe mode. The method that actually worked was using this command that I'll put down in the description down below. This allowed me to select safe mode on every single boot, and you can simply disable it by replacing the yes at the end with no. After that, I rebooted, pressed F8 and the number 5 to boot into safe mode. I'm not sure if safe mode was necessary, but when I tried installing the drivers without it, the screen went black again. I had to manually power it off, but when I rebooted, I got a blue screen this time saying I didn't have a recovery drive installation. So I went to my other PC, I grabbed a copy of that, and then installed it, but still no luck. To get back into Windows, I had to remove the GPU and connect the display port directly to the motherboard. This time, I was using safe mode. I removed all of the drivers via the clean installation and restart, reconnected the GPU and installed the drivers once again, but still no luck. I repeated the process a couple of times thinking one of them would work until I searched online for a similar issue. By this point, it was 11 p.m. and my friend was already deep asleep, so I couldn't ask him what he did. I found an article saying this was a known issue and that NVIDIA didn't expect a driver update to fix it. Instead, a BIOS update was necessary. That was the light bulb moment. I remember that's exactly what my friend did. So I found the BIOS update online, moved it to a flash drive, and hoped for the best. After flushing the BIOS, I booted into safe mode, removed the drivers, and reinstalled them again. This time, mid-installation, the screen went black again. But a couple of seconds later, it came back on. I was so relieved. I immediately texted my friend saying, "Dude, I am so proud of you for figuring this out on your own. This was such a tedious process that I don't know how it didn't scare him off." So now let's talk about after the build. With any ITX build, there are 5 things I keep in mind when reviewing or building: the build quality, the build process, the size versus the power, the aesthetics, and the thermals. So far, this build was off to a great start. The only real downside was the 2-slot GPU limitation. Aesthetics are subjective, but I personally like it. It's not the smallest of the bunch, but I don't know, this unique design is definitely something I've never seen before. Kind of looks like a speaker, but And now for the thermals, they're solid. My CPU is staying at a nice 80 degrees and the GPU at 60 degrees. It was definitely the seating of the cooler that caused those high temps before. Although I did notice a 90-degree spike when compiling shaders for Marble Rivals. All in all, I like this case, and I would definitely build in it again. For a future revision, I bet they'll make the panels all mesh, or allow us to move the spine of the case, just like the Fractal Terra and like a lot of other cases are doing nowadays. Then we can decide what do we want more, CPU cooler or GPU size. I don't know, I might even try to mod it myself. It might be a little risky, but who knows. Anyways, if you made it this far, I really appreciate you. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and leave some comments down below. I love replying to you all. I've got 2 more builds coming in the next 2 weeks, so subscribe to get notified. And with that, peace.